Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Linn Tabak. I will be moderating our discussion today. Our theme is immigration, and in particular, we'd like to think about how we would design a system of immigration for the United States if we had that opportunity to sweep the table clean and start anew. To help us in this discussion, I have three local people. Robin Clark-Bennett is a labor educator at the University of Iowa. John Solow is a professor of economics at the University of Iowa. And Jessica Malott is an attorney in Iowa City who deals with immigration issues. So I'd like to begin here by giving you each a few minutes to tell us about the work you do in our community and the interests that bring you into our discussion today. So maybe Robin, you'd like to start?
Sure. Well, as you said, I work at the University of Iowa Labor Center, which is a small component of the University of Iowa in Iowa City that was established in 1951 to conduct research and education about workers' rights and labor-related policy issues. And so we teach classes, both some classes on campus and around 100 classes a year off campus in all of the Iowa's 99 counties for workers and their organizations and about workers' rights issues.
Are these courses for academic credit? Are these courses for students who are matriculated at the university, or do you have a different or a larger role than that?
So our classes, we teach some classes as part of for-credit offerings for undergraduate and graduate students at times. Our classes for adult education are not for credit, and so they cover, workers' rights issues that are relevant to workers across the state of Iowa in industries all across the state on a variety of issues that they're facing in their workplaces and communities.
Okay. And John, you're a professor of economics at the university, and you've, I think, been a part of the university for many years.
For a long time, yes, and mainly what I'm doing these days is I'm the chairman of the department.
Okay.
Again, a job that I just took on this semester. So I'm doing an awful lot of administrating. My research tends to be in labor, actually tends to be in the area of sports and sports economics. Okay. So I'm interested in wage determination and how various institutional factors affect the wages and performance of baseball players frequently. But it's all part of the same thing.
Okay, Jessica, we're hoping an economist and a labor expert has something to add to this conversation, but your work is directly connected to our subject today, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I am an attorney at Vondra and Malott in Iowa City, and we also have an office in Des Moines. And I practice primarily immigration law. My focus is on family-based immigration for affirmative petitions, and I also represent people in immigration court. The nearest immigration courts where I generally practice are Omaha, Nebraska, and Chicago are the nearest ones.
So people have to travel for these?
Certainly. Thankfully, the immigration judges are nice enough to let us appear on the phone if it's just a short hearing. But yes, if you have a final hearing, you certainly have to go to that immigration court. And Omaha, for Iowa, is the nearest court. They have jurisdiction over residents of Iowa.
Was immigration a special interest of yours as you developed your career in the law? Was
it
an
is.
Early interest?
It is. I interned for the Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence when I was in law school, and then I also majored in Spanish as an undergraduate, so I definitely had interest that way. And I'm lucky I get to use my Spanish major on a daily basis. Many of my clients are native Spanish speakers.
Okay, very good. So let's see if we can, among the several of us here, list some of the things we would hope to see in a policy of immigration, some of the goals we might want to accomplish, some of the reasons we might want to bring people to the United States from elsewhere in the world. So before we come to this picture of the ideal policy, let's just begin in a small scale with some individual components. What would be an advantage of bringing people to the United States?
I mean, certainly a nuanced question with lots of things to address that we can't get to everything in a half an hour, but let's start off with the obvious, right? Family members. If you're a United States citizen or lawful permanent resident, certainly you would want to be able to petition for certain family members, right, to come to the United States. As it is now, there are several preference-based categories, and what that means are people in certain categories. Not everyone gets a visa immediately. Perhaps there's sometimes a misconception about how that is portrayed in the news. But for example, a United States citizen petitioning for a spouse has a visa immediately available to them after they go through, of course, a lengthy petition process. But if, for example, you're a United States citizen petitioning for a sister, you would fall into a preference category. And generally, I know I just checked the visa bulletin the other day for someone who's from Mexico, their sibling would wait 20 years probably before a visa is even immediately available. So certainly family members, the way the system is set up now, I think taking pieces from that isn't a terrible idea either.
So family could mean that an American marries a citizen from another country and brings that spouse home. A family could mean that a person in another country gains entry to the United States independently and then wants to bring dependents or other members of the family to the United States later. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
Okay.
But like I said, there's all sorts of caps or limits
Okay.
on the number of people for various categories. So it's not like, oh, I'm as a citizen petitioning for a sibling and they're immediately going to be able to come into the United States. It doesn't work like that.
So John, you've already told us that your expertise lies elsewhere, but
Sure.
With a long career in economics, you know what the branches of your field are. Could you tell us how economists, which economists or which branches of economics deal with these questions
Well,
that might be relevant?
So labor economists and to some extent international trade economists worry about these questions. In economics, the viewpoints are all over the map. I think that a lot of for example, take the question that a lot of people ask: Are immigrants stealing, quote unquote, stealing jobs from American citizens? First of all, it's a very misleading question. It's an inaccurate question. It suggests that there's a fixed number of jobs, and that having a job is a zero-sum game. That if I have one, you don't. But in fact, lots of people, you can always have more jobs. What impact the wages? What impact immigration has on the wages of low-income workers or higher-income workers who have to compete with immigrants? That one is there's a theory there, but the data is again kind of all over the map. There's a lot of dispute in economics about whether immigration lowers the wages of low-income workers, or for that matter, high-income workers. There are people who certainly argue that it does. There are certainly people who argue that it doesn't. So I guess one answer is to say we really don't know as much perhaps as we should about what the economic effects of immigration are. There are people on both the far left and the far right who argue that we should allow completely open immigration. I think there are probably some constraints on that. I think we should, for example, I think we have to be careful about, for security reasons, about who we let into the country. But I think that as a general matter, whatever policy, whoever we do let in, I think we should be humane about how we run the process. So those sorts of things. It's not so much who, but how.
So you're adding to our conversation. We have the goals we want to achieve with immigration, and then we also have these questions about finding a policy that's
Right.
humane, that we can
Predictable,
that we can
perhaps,
administer in a
and
good
so
way.
forth.
Right.
Not too expensive, right?
Well, Robin, what would you like to?
So I think that a lot of the discussion I hear assumes that there is a conflict, sort of an inherent conflict between U.S.-born workers and immigrant workers, and that's just not the reality that I see. And I think that people share far more in common. Workers share far more in common, regardless of where they were born, than their differences. And that's also true in terms of policy issues. So, you were asking what an ideal immigration policy looks like, and I think that what I've witnessed and researched indicates that, an incredibly important piece of immigration has got to be a robust workers' rights system that includes strong enforcement of core workers' rights. And so, let's take, for example, whether that's on a small level in terms of enforcement within operations, and I think on a broader level when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to global trade, will workers' rights be embedded in these systems? And I'll just offer the example of NAFTA. So that's a hot topic these days, right? What U.S.-born workers know is that that as a net, NAFTA had a detrimental impact on U.S. manufacturing jobs. What very few people know is that similarly, NAFTA was devastating to the agricultural subsistence farmers in Mexico. And so while there was a net loss of about 1 million manufacturing jobs in the U.S., at the same time, as a result of the policies embedded in NAFTA, about some estimate as many as 2 million Mexican small farmers were driven off the land because of an influx of cheap corn, and that continued to be subsidized here, but lost some of its subsidies there. And I say this just to illustrate that, the two groups actually have at their core some common concerns about the impacts of trade and whether low-income workers and farmers will be taken into consideration as these policies are implemented. And so as a result, people are dislocated from the land that they know and love, come here at a time like take NAFTA in the 90s, when workers' rights enforcement had been already badly damaged by deregulation, by diminishing enforcement, by diminishing unionization. And so I think that it's that this notion that native-born workers and immigrant workers are in conflict, I don't accept, and I think there's ample evidence and very interesting examples of both cross-border work between workers here and abroad and within the U.S. to lift up labor standards under the idea that workers do best when they band together across race and ethnicity to raise standards at home, abroad, and within our industries.
So I think part of what I'm hearing from Robin, and maybe the others will want to comment on this, is I think you're telling me that the immigration policy of the country has to be coupled with other policies. So some Americans are concerned about environmental protection and labor standards in foreign countries and see unfair competition because of that, because of lower standards elsewhere. If American foreign policy encouraged higher standards overseas, the numbers seeking entry to the United States might not be so great. Is that a fair comment? Does that resonate with anyone?
Sure. I want to follow up on something that Robin said, particularly with regards to NAFTA, because it's topical. I will be careful not to suggest that NAFTA is entirely a bad thing, right? So American manufacturers, workers lost their jobs, and Mexican agricultural workers, farmers lost theirs. I mean, down that road goes, well, then we ought to get rid of NAFTA, and we know who's in favor of that, and I, generally speaking, have problems with that. Remember that the beneficiaries of this change in the agricultural sector in Mexico are Iowans to a very large extent, right? Why did those farmers move off their land? Because they were now competing with Iowa corn and soybean, and that we saw a large increase in sales of American products, American agricultural products to Mexico. And as the current administration is thinking about setting up tariff barriers, who's getting hurt by that? It's Iowans, right? And so it really is hurting them right now, right? So talk to soybean farmers, and the prices are down 10%, and they're very upset about this. So there are trade is a good thing. Economists disagree about practically everything. There are jokes about that, right? please give me a one-armed economist so he won't say on the one hand and the other hand. It's a bad joke. But the one thing that economists are overwhelmingly in favor of is free trade. If you do a survey, it's 95, 98% of economists think that free trade is a good thing. And it's the same logic that suggests that the free movement of capital and the free movement of labor are good things too. Right? We like to be able to invest in each other's countries and have people invest their money here. Well, we should allow people to invest their time and work effort here too. So economists, generally speaking, are in favor of freer movement of goods, of people, of financial capital, of money.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on that and just underline the fact that labor advocates are not, for the most part, advocating protectionism when it comes to international trade, but rather saying, let's give as much attention and enforcement capacity to labor standards and the rights of low-income people as we do to investors, multinational investors.
I absolutely agree with that.
And so that's, I think, you've raised an important point. And so just to clarify, often we talk about trade only from the lens of national, sort of nation-based corporations and multinational corporations, and not from the lens of what truly creates the kinds of protections that lift up labor standards here and abroad. And that's the case also in our national policies increasingly, is that sort of the legacy of the some would call it trickle-down economics or neoliberal economics, right? Is that we've seen deterioration in worker protections, and I think that's the issue, right? So it's not, from a worker, what I hear from labor advocates is, this concern about lowering standards, about the degradation of labor standards, is about the absence of rights more than it's about the presence of people. And so if you have 11 million people who are increasingly, forced into a situation of intense fear and denied rights, that's what's creating, that's what contributes to an overall degradation of standards, not the presence of people who, we see time and time again are willing to organize and lift up standards if they don't face incredible barriers to doing so.
Well, something that you've learned in your professional practice that might have changed your opinion or given you a sense of where we should go, Jessica?
That's a good question. I've learned a lot, but one thing I think that we haven't really differentiated is that are we talking about permanent residents of the United States? Are we talking about temporary residents? I mean, there's certainly an influx of, for example, the University of Iowa students. Lots of students are international students on F1 visas, for example, who are here for a limited period of time. Once their course of study is complete, generally return to their home countries. I mean, sharing that intercultural exchange, we certainly can all benefit from that. I think we would all agree.
Sure.
But there's just so many different nuanced pieces, that goes to immigration. I think that we have to examine all of that, right? Temporary, permanent visas, for example.
In your work, are you dealing also with high-skilled, high-income people who are?
So I typically focus on family-based immigration and then removal defense and immigration court. I don't typically do employment-based visas and residency through that, but you certainly can obtain, short-term visas, for example, through the H-1B process, which I know is capped every year. It could eventually lead to a green card or lawful permanent residency if you have an employer that sponsors you, but you have to meet certain pretty rigorous requirements. And there's a whole host of employment-based visas that have various really specific requirements that I don't think people realize are so rigorous in order to get them.
So in my reading, I've seen people argue that the United States should move towards a so-called points-based system, a system that would put greater priority on qualifying immigrants who bring skills that would add to the American economy, and putting less emphasis on offering refuge or offering family reunification. And I'd like to hear some comments on, could that work? How would we choose which skills qualify immigrants?
I don't know how I feel about that, because don't we as a nation have a moral obligation to help people who are seeking refuge or who need humanitarian help? For example, like temporary protected status, folks who perhaps were victims of a natural disaster in their home country and are seeking refuge in the US, perhaps for a temporary period of time. Or, you know, this is in the news a lot, DACA, deferred action for the childhood arrivals who were brought here as children under the age of 16 through no decision of their own. Things like that I think we do as a nation have an obligation to assist those people.
I'm going to put in a plug here for a book by a friend. So I think we should be really careful about thinking about all the negatives, right? There are huge positives to having a diverse population, and I don't just mean racially diverse, but diverse in terms of experience and ways of thinking and things like that. So I have a former colleague and friend, Scott Page, now at the University of Michigan, who's just written his second book on this. It's called The Diversity Bonus, which I'm working through now. But he documents how teams work much better, groups of people work much better when people come in with different viewpoints and different ideas. And that's where the creativity comes from, where people have different ideas and different experiences, share those things, and we blend them together somehow. The other thing I'd just point out is that, you know, as my son pointed out to me today, you know, nobody forces people to eat tortillas, to eat tacos instead of meat and potatoes, right? Our culture is much richer and better because we have all these things that came from abroad, music and art and food and things like that. And to suggest that we should all be the same and we should all, you know, be kind of good white Midwesterner meat and potatoes kind of people, I think it would be a very boring world to live in. Nobody forces anybody to watch TV that as diverse populations, or watch movies that are made by people from other countries and other cultures. So you're always free to watch whatever you want, eat whatever you want, but it opens up the set of opportunities. And again, I'll quote, so Molly Tibbetts' father said, you know, as far as he's concerned, they're Iowans with better food. And that was a very telling thing for him to say, right?
So to say that some immigration is good or some additional diversity is good isn't the same as saying that more is better. There's 7 billion people on the planet, there are 325 million Americans. This ideal policy has to give us some criteria for deciding not whether to admit immigrants, but how many and which ones. Those are the hard questions, I think.
Yeah, and I would both agree with what the other panelists have said in terms of the importance of family unification and understanding that families will find a way to unite, and that's an important value that we share, and that there's an incredible cultural and economic benefit. And look, I mean, the reality is we're in a state with a declining population. We've lost congressional representatives. Some of our small towns are dying, and I'm from small town Iowa. And I think that we should be celebrating an influx of young families, and I think that that's really revitalizing a lot of our state. I think that it's also worth saying that, contrary to sort of some of the perspectives I hear, that it's not that everyone in the world can't wait to be in the U.S. or wants to be in Iowa, and that there are push and pull factors that in place, and that our law has to reflect the reality of our global context. And I think that our law is badly out of sync with that right now. And that's evidenced by the fact that there are 11 million people, many of whom would do almost anything to find a way to adjust their status. But the law is not providing a path for most of the 11 million people who are here without documents. So it's not that people are not willing to pay or stand in a line, it's that our law refuses to accept what has been the reality for several decades. And so I think that our law has to reflect the global reality, and that that it should then establish rights and protections in that context.
I mean, the immigration laws have not undergone a big change at all since 1996. I mean, and that is crazy if you think about it. Our world has changed so much since then, and really the most recent big immigration law was in 1996. I mean, I just think we're playing catch up with immigration.
Okay.
Well, and even within the law, I mean, to be quite frank, we're changing the numbers, right? And I think we're changing them in a bad way. So we've always been able to take refugees, right? But the current administration wants fewer and fewer, and they keep just pushing the number down. I don't know the number. I don't know how our numbers, how the number of refugees we admit compares to Canada or Germany or the UK. But let's be quite honest about it. Some of this is just out and out bigotry, and there's no good excuse for that, right? Well, we hear our president talk. Why can't we have people from the countries that he likes and not from these other countries? And some of it is just plain out and out bigotry, and there's no excuse for that. There's no justification for that.
Absolutely.
So how would you pick how many?
Oh gosh, that's complicated.
Well, I would say there is a cost-benefit aspect to this, right? I do think that we can't. I don't want, and I am a liberal and a Democrat. I don't want free, open borders. I think, particularly because of security matters, we do want to know who's coming into this country and who's here, and so we need a system of visas and vetting people and the like. That's expensive, right? It takes time and effort and resources, and so the more people you're going to let in, the more effort, the more taxpayer dollars have to be devoted to that sort of thing. I would say my personal preference is to do more of it. I think that we vet people from certain countries for years before they have a chance of getting in.
We're near the end of our
And I would just add that the worst way to make us safer is to criminalize and isolate millions of people uniformly. I think that creating the kind of fear in communities that we've established means that that people are less likely to come to police. They're less likely to speak up about true violations and security issues that they witness.
I don't disagree. But that's not what I was suggesting that we ought to be doing.
Right.
We're near the end here. You might want to think of maybe there's a message for our audience of where you'd like them to be thinking more about this issue or learning more. Maybe a few words of
Sure. I mean, this is a super complex issue, and I mean, you can just read for days and days about it, but I would advise people to educate themselves, and then if they have a strong opinion, call their congressional representative and talk to them about it.
John?
I'm going to plug Scott Page's book called The Diversity Bonus.
Okay. And
Have a
Robin?
read.
I think that division and mass incarceration makes us all weaker and is costly economically in terms of workers' rights and to our nation as a whole, and we should take a different route.
Thank you all for a great conversation. Thank you for joining us on Ethical Perspectives on the News, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.